So that brings us up to the program. The title here is Native Plants and Rainwater Harvesting. Learn how to save money, conserve water, and beautify your yard. Our speakers today are Jeff Schlau, who's the agent with the Agriculture and Natural Resources and County Extension Director for the University of Arizona Cooperative Extension in Yavapai County, and he'll give us some examples of native tree and shrub species that require little or no irrigation once established, and he'll explain how to plant, irrigate, and tend new plants to best ensure their successful growth, all in 35 or 40 minutes. So look out. Here comes an information blast. And then the second speaker is Josh Carruthers, who's the owner of Prescott Landscape Professionals, and he'll talk about landscape design that uses rainwater for irrigation and discuss on-site storage methods for captured rainwater. So what we'll do is have each of these gentlemen talk and give their presentation, and then we won't take questions during the presentations. After they've both presented, they'll both be here at the front table, and I'll pass the mic around, and we'll have at least a half an hour to answer audience questions and to have a discussion. So let's start off with Jeff Schlau. And welcome, Jeff, and thank you so much for coming.
Good morning, everyone. I know many of you. I see lots of friendly faces in the audience. Most of those friendly faces in the room right now are Master Gardener volunteers. We have about 181 Master Gardener volunteers on county-wide, and we have help desks in our office. So just a quick cooperative extension commercial. How many of you are aware of cooperative extension and the services? Okay, keep your hands up. Those of you that have your hands up, how many of you were from farming communities or someplace in the east? And oh, that's a good ratio. A lot of people put their hands down, and there's a high correlation to people that were from the Midwest or from farming communities that know about cooperative extension. But a lot of people don't, and so for those that would like to come and learn more about our services, on this handout, and there's only enough handouts, I think there's enough couples in the room that if you take one per couple, we'll have enough. And then otherwise, I can make it available to CWAG, and we can put it with the presentation or something like that. But as Gary said, I'm just going to only be able to hit the high points. And if you need more information, we have an office just a few blocks from here on the Prescott Rodeo grounds. We also have an office in Camp Verde if you're interested in visiting that. And that information is on the back of the handout that I'm giving you. So I better start covering some territory here. But one of the things I'd like to just make clear as we begin is that all the information that I present is research-based, and that's the research-based information is what cooperative extension is. That's our part and parcel of our message, and a lot of the things, maybe one of the things that you see today will be new to you, and maybe even you'll think that it might not be exactly what you've done in the past, but we'll talk about it. I'm not going to focus on giving you a litany of plants with pictures and things like that. Those resources are out there. I'm going to tell you how to plant them and take care of them and make sure that they survive and try to get them so that they can be as least water consumptive as possible from potable water sources or even from harvested water sources. I'd like to see our rainwater harvested sources go to growing food rather than landscape too, you know. And growing food is an important part that, this is just one of my plugs, that's never part of the conversation. So, and I think it's important that we know how to grow our own food. So I'll stop there. I'm going to talk about these different classes of plants. I'm grouping the cacti and succulents in with the shrubs here. But, you know, evergreen trees, unless you're on a really mesic type site, you're going to have to irrigate them or you're not going to have them. A bark beetle or another pest will take them out. So, but often those kinds of plants are what people use for screening and things like that. If you really want to get into some interesting conversations, talk to people about evergreens in Sedona when the neighbor's view is getting blocked. grasses, we could talk just about grasses, but what I'm going to encourage you to do is try to occupy all the space on your landscape and then understand a little bit about what the place looked like before your house was built on it, so that you can mimic the surrounding natural vegetation in your own yard. And if you've got gravel mulches, that doesn't really mimic it. And also, we'll talk about mulches and what's appropriate, but I'm more of the opinion that we should cover the ground with small drought-resistant plants and things like grasses and things that have a dormant season, so that we can actually mitigate erosion, provide some habitat, and do things like that as well. And so there'll be more about that to come. So just some definitions. Drought tolerant, you know, this is plants that'll survive with minimal irrigation or rainfall. Drought resistant are plants that can survive for long periods without water. And anyway, drought resistant plants, maybe I should stand a little bit more over here so that we can get everything up here too in the picture. I'm being filmed in the back if you didn't know. Anyway, drought-resistant plants, those are the ones that once they're established, they pretty much better be able to survive on what ambient moisture they get, or they'll just fade away and something else will take their place. And that's kind of what happens in nature, and that's what I'm going to encourage you to think about in your landscape, is to mimic what happens in natural systems. Native plants, you know, okay, cottonwood's a native plant. I'm not going to tell you to plant a cottonwood tree, though, so you have to put some qualification with these things. Just because you have a native plant garden, that doesn't mean it's water conserving. And so the other half of that, though, is many of our native plants are water conserving. And Chris Hoy just pointed out to me at the beginning of our presentation today, there's a nice little demonstration garden right along the front of the building here that CWAG has assisted in. Some of the plants are labeled. Some of the labels have fallen off, but Chris and I talked about it, and he's going to be working on that to get things restored. There's some really nice species right there. And I'm going to suggest some species, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. If I only have a half hour, I'm going to tell you how to plant to encourage the things that you're planting to be more successful. And as the last bullet says, you know, many of the drought-tolerant and drought-resistant plants that we grow are not from here. And as long as we can ensure that they're not going to be invasive, then those plants are going to be desirable plants to consider too. So there are a few of those that I've blended in, and I think we get too, sometimes if we're just native focused, we'll lose sight of what the overall goal is, because a lot of us also like to have a little bit of fall color and other things as part of our gardens. And you can have a lot of those things with drought-tolerant plants, but they may not always be a native drought-tolerant plant. Also, the definition of what's native to some people goes a little bit further to others. For instance, a lot of our drought-tolerant plants are from the Chihuahuan Desert, and that's not native to here. And because we don't live in the Chihuahuan Desert, but those plants are very appropriate, many of them, for our area. So the biggest thing that I want you to know is that if you're planting a woody plant, these are some of the guidelines that you should follow. And on the second page of the handout that I gave you, there is a resource list, and one of the resources there is planting containerized plants and staking them. The title of it exactly is Planting Guidelines, Container Trees and Shrubs, and it goes through this and some of the rationale for this. I'm not going to be able to go through all of the rationale, but I'm going to touch on it, and I apologize to the master gardeners that have heard this many times, but this is where the research base comes in. This planting idea, this planting standard has been developed through research nationwide, from the East Coast to the West Coast, and actually up in the north, they're telling you if you buy a containerized plant, you should bare root it before you plant it. I've tried it a couple of times. Don't go that far yet. Leave the root ball on it when you purchase it, but you might want to look at it for circling roots. And when you're looking at plants, don't buy the biggest one and don't go to the bargain bin, Go to the ones that are just rooted the right amount with white roots showing around the edge of the pot. If you see any circling roots, you can try and mitigate it, but if they're woody, pass that one by. So we recommend planting in a wide, shallow hole. I like the hole to be 3 to 5 times as wide as the root ball. And really just backing up for a second, the real thing to think about when we're talking about this planting method is, again, going back to nature and thinking about all the millions of seeds that all the plants produce and how only a few of those survive. Yet we as human beings buy one plant and look at one spot and decide that that has to be the place where that plant goes and it has to survive there. And in nature, it's all trial by error. The whole area is basically saturated with seed, and the seeds that survive are the ones that find the good spot. So keep that in mind. So we're trying to create a good spot by doing this. So we'll dig a wide, shallow hole with sloping walls, 3 to 5 times the diameter of the root ball, and no deeper than the root ball. You don't have to remove all of the soil out of the hole, but you at least need to loosen it with a digging bar. And the reason behind all of this is that tree has to learn, or shrub, has to learn how to survive in that soil for its entire life. If you're adding amendments to that soil, which is the next bullet point here, you do not amend the backfill of the tree planting hole. This is the part that most people have an issue with. They've been taught dig a hole twice as deep and twice as wide and 50% full of amendment. But anybody that's a vegetable gardener in here knows what happens to that organic amendment in 1 year. It disappears. It decomposes. We have very alkaline soils, so then half of the volume of that soil that you put in there, the backfill, is going to be gone in a year. So don't put amendments in your backfill. If you don't have 18 inches of soil there, you probably aren't going to be successful with a tree also. You can remove the rock fragments that are in there, but because the rock fragments they don't have any water holding capacity or nutrient releasing capacity, but put the native soil back in the hole. As I said, the root ball sits on undisturbed soil, and if you're going to use organic matter, use an organic mulch on the soil surface. So what's the difference between mulch and compost? Well, I know you're not supposed to talk because questions are at the end, so I'll answer the question. I guess it's rhetorical. The mulch goes on the soil surface. Compost is a soil amendment that goes into the soil. There are times to use compost when you're planting annuals, when you're planting vegetable gardens, and in some other situations. But usually with woody plants, you want to just plant in the native soil and then use a nice mulch layer to mitigate other factors that we'll cover as we go through the presentation. No unnecessary pruning. So ideally, we'd like to see a tree that has branches all the way to the ground. One of my colleagues likes to describe a tree as a self-pruning shrub. So as it gets larger and larger, it shades out its lower branches and starts to look like a tree. But when they grow as seedlings, they don't look like trees. We've convinced the nursery industry that that's what we have to buy, but ideally we would want to see foliage all the way to the ground on that. But you cannot find those unless you work with really educated growers who have a very eclectic clientele, because most consumers don't want to buy a tree that doesn't look like a tree yet. So, I'll get off my soapbox with that. Staking only if necessary. Staking causes a lot of damage to plants. The staking is only there to stabilize the root ball, because if the root ball is moving around in the soil, then those roots move out and try and establish in the native soil, and they're getting disturbed as that root ball moves. So the root ball has to be stable, and that's really the only reason for staking. This type of staking method that's shown here is an adequate staking method, but again, staking is covered in the publication that's referenced at the end. And then you need to irrigate it regularly until it's established, because what we want this plant to do is go out and exploit this native soil out here, because the more roots it has beyond where the planting hole was, the better it will be able to get the rainwater and the nutrients that are there on site, and it will actually be closer to mimicking a tree that grows without human assistance. These native trees, they grow where they're going to grow because they get their roots to the right place. They have basically their own rainwater harvesting system that allows them to survive. So now I'm going to show you a few pretty pictures of some drought-tolerant trees. And first off, this example here, the Chinese pistache, it's not a native tree, but it's a very nice drought-tolerant deciduous tree that's highly appropriate for our area. In general, what I like to say is a fast-growing tree is a short-lived tree. So things like cottonwoods and willows, they don't survive longer than 15 years here, even if you irrigate them, because they're riparian. They need to have their feet in water all the time. This is a drought-tolerant species, that does extremely well, and I showed it in the photo with the fall color that you will get with it too. Oklahoma redbud, there's many redbuds that you can find, but the Oklahoma one tends to take the wind and arid weather that we get. It has a thicker leaf with a heavier cuticle. Emery oak, of course, well, let's look at the desert willow. I'm sure many of you have these in your yards, and they're beautiful plants and look really good all through the summer season. They're deciduous, of course, so they don't look like much right now. Some people think they're trashy, and they make a lot of seeds, is really what the trashy part is. Emery oak, a lot of people wouldn't classify it as a deciduous tree, but it gives me an opportunity to describe something that several of our native oak species do, and we call them summer deciduous or spring deciduous because in May and June, that's when they drop their leaves here, the hottest, driest months. It never completely drops all of its leaves. Emery oak is one of our really excellent native oaks, and they're available in the commercial nursery trade. Evergreens, as I mentioned, they're going to require irrigation, but some people like to have screening, and one of the things, I didn't get it on here in this slide, but the bristlecone pine is planted around here, as is the limber pine. Those are 5-needle pines. They look kind of like bottle brushes, much more densely needled than the pinyon pines. I would have mentioned also the deodar cedar, which is the courthouse, the statehood tree at the courthouse, but that's usually too big for most residential landscapes. I see them in there, but as I'm saying, they're a little bit large for most people's space. But the Atlas cedar is a little smaller and a little better behaved. There's one of those on the south side of the courthouse plaza. Incense cedar, I just threw that one in because there's a couple of these around town. That's a California native, and it's the one that typically pencils were made out of. When all of us in the room, I'm noticing I'm with a bunch of folks that are, right around my age, and maybe, a lot of you are younger than I am probably. But anyway, that pencil smell is the incense cedar smell, and that's also where Pecky cedar came from, when you used to see a lot more of that. And then, of course, one of our local natives, the Arizona cypress, which really requires some irrigation. It's a native, but when you see it, it's usually on a wet site where there's shallow bedrock and it can gather its own water resources. Moving forward, I've got lists of others. Given the time constraints that I have, I'm not going to go through each one. And I do not think that I included lists of trees in the text of what I handed out to you, but there are references to plant lists at the end, so you can look at those. And all of these are local natives, except for the honey locust and the Texas red oak. These are all the rest of them. Well, the black locust and the purple robe locust are not either. But all of these are really pretty tough plants that can get by once they're established with 12 to 18 inches of rainfall a year, as long as it comes at the right time. Last winter was tough, and some of you probably lost plants. Evergreens had an especially tough year last winter, just because of the dry spells. So I'm going to keep this moving. Some shrubs that I like. So somebody's probably going to kill me, but I put heavenly bamboo in there. It's very drought tolerant. It has berries that attract birds in the winter. It's not anything close to native, but it does well here. It's not invasive. It has fall color. It is very low maintenance, and there's lots of, from little short ones to ones that get this high, different cultivars. The rubber rabbit brush, some people would probably claim that this one's invasive, and it tends to get invasive at places like Prescott Lakes and stuff like that because there's irrigation there, and it will follow the irrigation and proliferate there. It's also a really important plant in our area for migrating monarchs late in the summer. The mountain mahogany, I bet each of us probably has these in our yard or just outside of our property. Very common plant in the local area. Fremont barberry is a spiny devil. It's a large plant, and if you wanted to put in a hedge that would exclude foot traffic, that's the perfect one. If you've ever tried to even touch one of these things, it's a dicey proposition. But it's a beautiful plant, adapted to our environment, and beautiful flowers and berries, as well as a really nice foliage. Here's some other ones that I didn't include pictures on, but I'm pretty sure that some of this will be visible to the folks that are able to view the video, and at least that's my hope for including them. Most of these are natives, because I think our shrub palette is really strong here. Creosote bush is probably not going to do well in Prescott, but if you move down the hill to about 3,000 feet, it would probably do just fine there. But all of the rest of these above, from this point upward, are highly appropriate, and I noticed I just doubled on that one. But and Mormon tea, it tends to grow a little bit at a lower elevation too. Anyway, some really nice, interesting plants here that we don't have time to go into detail about, but if you want to find them in the presentation, you can go back and see that. Here's a few more. This plant at the top of the list, this one has a lot of potential. It's a beautiful little evergreen shrub. It's not real common here, but I think you look around and there's probably, several of these per acre out there, but it's just not real common, but it's a beautiful little shrub. Similarly, sugar bush and lemonade berry, these are just all plants that you'll find along the riparian areas, and they would do perfectly well once established in a drought-tolerant landscape. In fact, that the golden currant is planted right out here. So, continuing on, cacti and succulents are really, they're the epitome of a drought-tolerant plant. And the one thing about them, of course, is that some of them are very spiny, but some of them are pretty friendly too. It's not in the photos here, but the red yucca, it's not really a yucca at all. It's got soft leaves. It's not going to poke you like a true yucca would. This is our native yucca in the area, as this is our native agave in this area. Both of them are very nice plants, but what I'll caution you about when we get to this part of the presentation is that all of these plants are protected by native plant law, and if you don't have a certificate that allows you to transport that plant, if you're just going out somewhere and gathering it and the plant police find you, you will get in trouble. And it's not very likely that they will, but that native plant law was developed for cactus rustling in the Phoenix area, for saguaros. People did steal saguaros at one time, and anyway, that's the native plant law, and it includes mesquites and palo verdes and lots of other desert shrubs as well. One of my favorite local cacti is this claret cup cactus. Of course, there's some other species of this that even have more intensely beautiful flowers. And then, of course, the prickly pears. There's lots of these prickly pears that we grow. This is the one that's very common in this area. But all of these plants are nice plants, but if you had a whole yard full of agaves, that might be a little intense or even boring. But agaves make a really nice focal point near an entryway, and they establish colonies because they produce pups at the base. And so even when this big one here is going to flower and then die, leave that dead flower stalk there. It's beautiful. And if a tree dies in your yard, a native tree, leave the dead tree there if it's not going to fall on somebody. because there's lots of other organisms that can use these as habitat. Woodpeckers, and all the way down to invertebrates and all kind of levels of life. And so I think as living in this area, we have to adjust our aesthetic to be able to understand that the natural world has dead stuff in it too, and that dead stuff is an important part of the living stuff. So just another little advertisement, I guess. Whoops. Now for the grasses. There's a lot of different grasses, both ornamental and non-ornamental. The ones to avoid are pampas grass and fountain grass. Don't plant those, they're invaders, and they aren't very nice. The pampas grass in particular is wicked if you've ever tried to work with it. It's just like a knife edge on the edge of the leaf blades. But deer grass is used a lot in commercial landscapes. You see it in entryways to various places. It's a medium-sized grass. Looks good pretty much all year round, except when some of the landscape maintenance companies try and prune it into little circles and little cubes and things like that. That just looks funny to me. I hate it. But if you don't graze these plants once in a while, whether you're using an animal to do it or whether you're using your foot to kick the dead material out, the centers will die out on these. So the vegetation needs to be removed in the dormant period to allow light to penetrate down into that crown so those grasses will come back. And those that have deer grass and have had it for 10 years know what I'm talking about. The center of the plants will die out. It's a bunch of straw. It gets piled up in there, and then you have these little ring-shaped plants. Blue grama is the one that looks like the little eyelash, very common here. And side oats is very common here as well. Needle and thread grass. Grasses come in warm season and cool season. The needle and thread is the one cool season grass that I included. So those cool season grasses are growing now. They flower in June or May, and then they lie dormant through the hot weather. These other ones wait for the monsoon rains for their growth period, and then they show their stuff like this usually in the fall. And most of the ornamental ones are warm season, and if you have clumps of these on your property, you can just go and divide the clumps during the active growing season. Like I have some fruit trees. Well, I irrigate those fruit trees once in a while, and the native grasses creep in. Well, I dig up the native grasses, I split them up, and then I plant little, propagules of them in places that are bare, water them for a little while, and then they take. So just keep that in mind. You might have the resources right on your property, and you won't even have to buy anything. Just divide what you have. And blue grama and side oats grama do that fairly well. And I'll just make a plug for side oats. It's one that it's the one that you can grab. It has the little seeds, and you pull it like this, and you'll get a handful of seed, and throw that seed around, and those seeds will grow if they land on fertile. Well, if they land on mineral soil and they get a little bit of moisture at the right times. So moving forward, I'm not going to talk about plant species much from here. Gary, how much time do I have left? 8 minutes. Perfect. Thank you so much. So, mulch. I mentioned that I'd talk about it a little more. Organic mulches are what I recommend. Not organic, certified organic like food, but something that's made out of a plant material or something like that. Inorganic mulches really get hot. They will have some of these positive effects, but this lower picture, there's a lot of rock landscapes around. And in order to maintain a rock landscape like this, that doesn't have cheatgrass and other weeds growing in it, you have to pre-emerge it. And that's a herbicide. So you have to, that's how the commercial landscapes or other gravel landscapes, they have a spray program, and probably one of the local yard maintenance folks that has a spray permit is going around and spraying it with pre-emergent twice a year to prevent the weeds from germinating. If you use this kind of mulch, which you can often get for free at the transfer station, you spread around a 3 or 4 inch layer of that, and that will prevent weeds. It will decompose. It will hold in the soil moisture. It will insulate the soil, keeping it cooler. It will prevent erosion from surface water flow. It will improve the water infiltration, which is something that we're also looking for, especially if you're in a place like Prescott Valley where you have clay soils. Those soils are slow to take on water, so mulch will help with that too. And in the rainwater harvesting side, when you're talking about rainwater harvesting, you have to understand that your soil has to accept the water. Otherwise, it's just surface flow that goes right past your place. So mulch will help with that. It can have a neat appearance. Some folks may consider this rustic. I think it looks nice. Pine needles are an excellent mulch, by the way. But the other thing about mulches is if they're right up next to a deck, if they're in your gutters on your roof and things, you need to think about fire-wise considerations as well. Because where we live, fire is as much the part of the ecosystem as the deer and the javelina and the grama grass and everything else. And so we need to understand that, and we're very slow to get that message in our area, in the West in general. I'll stop editorializing again. So there's all kinds of different mulches you can get, bark. This is the chipped wood, usually from like line clearances that APS is doing or another utility company. But pine needles are awesome. Straw kind of tends to blow away, but if you want to find weed-free straw, it can be found, and that's what ADOT uses on their projects. Plastic mulches, of course, I shouldn't have included that one. That's more for agriculture. But it is a type of mulch. But don't put plastic under your mulch, right? Most of us have learned that message. But there's crushed rock, and back east they even have crushed brick. And so moving to the next slide, we did a mulch flammability study a few years ago with 8 different mulches. We couldn't get the gravel to light on fire, but we could get the straw and the pine needles to light on fire pretty well, and we developed some pretty good flame lengths from those. There's a publication about this, but we included grass and some commercial products and those wood chips, and it was a replicated study. It was done here in Prescott, it was done in Flagstaff, and done in Tucson a summer many years ago. 2 to 4 inches deep is typically a good amount. If you're using organic mulches, you'll just have to top dress it from time to time because it does break down over time. Landscape fabrics, those spun fabrics that they sell you to put the mulch on top of, I've never seen those work well. Usually what happens is they start fraying and they get exposed and then it's a big mess, and I just would recommend that you just put the mulch right on the soil surface. Then it's worth mentioning also that I think I already did, gravel and DG mulches are really kind of sterile. Wildlife doesn't like those. If you want to encourage birds and small mammals and reptiles and things, the reptiles probably won't mind them, but the more diversity, the more cover you have, and I'll show you a picture at the end of what I like. That's what I would encourage you to think about. And I already mentioned the commercial areas and using pre-emergent on the gravel mulches. So keeping on moving, just understanding what a native grown tree root system looks like. Most of our trees here do not have a tap root. They have lateral roots that go on 3 to 5, maybe even more times the height of the tree away. And so when you're irrigating something like this, theoretically this tree wouldn't need irrigating, but if you were going to irrigate it, the feeder roots are out in here, and that's where the irrigation should go. You really don't want to concentrate much water around this root crown because it can cause rot problems on trees that aren't well adapted to being backfilled with soil. That's probably all the time we have for that one. But anyway, I wanted you to look at what a tree root system should look like, because then when we're starting to irrigate it, we can put a berm here and here, keep the water away from the trunk in this area, and then concentrate it on the feeder roots. I forgot to grab my steel probe, but we sell these steel probes at our office. It's basically an old-fashioned irrigation key that's had the fork part cut off it and a rounded tip, and you can push that steel rod into the ground and pretty much tell exactly how deep the irrigation water or the rainfall has gone. And you can monitor that, and it you know, it'll tell you when and if you need to irrigate supplementally. It'll also be a nice probe to use when you're setting gopher traps, which many of us have to do. In fact, somebody needs to do it in the native garden right out in front here. In general, when we're trying to irrigate a plant, little plants like ground covers and annuals and perennials will only need to be irrigated about a foot deep. Shrubs, if you can get the water down a couple of feet, or if the rainfall goes a couple of feet, the soil's really well saturated out there right now, right? And it'll stay that way because there's not a lot of active growth going on. The evergreens are growing, but the deciduous trees are not, and a lot of the grasses are still dormant. A tree will also have its roots up to 3 feet deep, but most of the nutrient uptake and water uptake is going to happen in the upper part. But when you water deep, most soils are fine enough textured that that deep water is pulled back to the surface through capillary action. We talked about that a little bit at last week's meeting, or last month's meeting here, related to cutting down junipers and trying to produce more water and so on. The capillary action, the rainfall rarely goes below a couple of feet, and the capillary action always pulls it back to the surface. So if you're thinking about recharge, you've got to get it down below that zone and into some gravel bed or something to get down to the aquifer levels. But in a yard, in general, if you can get the water down this deep when you're trying to establish, these are the kinds of root systems that we're hoping to establish so that they radiate in all directions and are able to gather their own water and nutrients. I know I'm coming in on the home stretch here. This illustration just shows, when you see a little wet spot under a drip emitter here, in a sandy soil, what's subsurface will look like this. In a loamy soil, it's fine textured. So the capillary action is pulling the water horizontally as well as going down through the forces of gravity. And then on a clay soil, that wetting pattern is even more pronounced horizontally. These are just methods. I'm really, drip irrigation's the best and the worst thing ever invented. If you never expand it, you will never get the root system that we want on a native or a planted tree. Because those two emitters are usually right at the trunk. That's where the roots are going to amass themselves, and you've got to encourage them to go beyond that. So you need to irrigate out beyond the planting hole to encourage those roots to go out there for a couple of years. Once they get out there, they'll find their own way. I just showed a couple of different irrigation methods here. That's just a little drip emitter, but this is a multi-port head. So this can be added onto. These are capped off, but you could add 3 more. There's actually these kinds of arrangements that will have 12 pieces of spaghetti tube on them. So they can be expanded. That's generally a much more sustainable way to drip irrigate. But if you just plant a tree and you hand water it for a couple of years to get it established, that's probably better than anything. Because when you're hand watering, you're actually out there interacting with your plants. If you're just turning a clock, you're not in touch. You don't know what's going on out there. So you need to go out and look, touch, feel. Is the soil dry? Is this tree too young? Does it need water? Or am I over-applying water and kind of going against the goals of CWAG there? Micro sprayers, usually they're just used in orchards and so on. That's these down here. But these bubblers can fill in basins pretty nicely. Again, it's an art. All of this here that I've talked about is an art as much as it is a science. And irrigation really gets into the art side of it. You really have to watch what's going on, understand your soil, and how fast it can take on water, and then apply the appropriate amounts at the appropriate times. And we can talk more about that another time, I'm sure, since we don't have all the time in the world today. Soaker hoses I mentioned on there too. I'll just go back for a second. A lot of people use these here, especially in times of drought, to keep plants that are very special to them alive, pinions, ponderosas, and things like that. These soaker hoses are really great. They put out a small amount of water. You can loop them right around that drip line, but they do clog up with minerals after a couple of years, and so they have a shortened lifespan. Don't fertilize. If you grow fruit trees, if you grow vegetables, if you grow flowers, fertilize. Don't fertilize this ornamental stuff. You'll kill it. Or you'll cause so much tender growth that it'll be more attractive to wildlife, so they'll come and munch on it, or insects and diseases. The reasons are all put here. It'll outgrow the space that you've allotted more quickly. Fertilizer is not your friend with native plants. It also discourages mycorrhizal associations, which are natural in the soil, and all of our native woody plants here have these associations. And if you're fertilizing, there's no reason for the plant to form that association with that fungi. So, long story short, if you want to kill a manzanita, water it and fertilize it. By the way, manzanita are one of the tougher native trees or plants to grow. There are some nursery types. I think the one that's planted right out here is the Howard McMinn variety, which is really the only one that's available commercially. But if you look at our manzanitas locally, they air layer. The end branches go down, they touch the soil, they root there. You might have some luck transplanting one of those, or if you air layered it right into a pot, that would probably be a nice way to try and propagate a manzanita or two. Moving on to the finale here, we have a lot of web resources, which I've included on the back page of this. One of them is I've been writing a weekly newspaper column for 21 years now in the Verde Valley. All of those are online. It's searchable by keyword, by any word, not just keyword. And almost any topic that's a gardening question in our area has been covered there at some point in time. But this particular site is a project that the Master Gardeners have worked on. I know Doug McMillan's in the room. He's worked on this project some. Any other Master Gardeners that have worked on this project in the room today? Yes. Yes. Hey, how you doing, John? So this project, it has about 700 or so plants in it. 500 of them are forbs. Those are the little herbaceous guys. There's 60-some native grasses. All of our native trees are in there, all of our native shrubs and cacti and so on. The forbs we really made a push on in the last few years. Those are the little herbaceous weedy things that most of us don't look at. But this resource is also illustrated or linked. The web URL is included. And coming in for the final thoughts here, mimic the vegetation that was there before your house was built. If you're doing building projects, put up that orange fence and keep the construction people off where you don't want them to be. That's not on here. Eliminate weeds using competition rather than trying to maintain bare ground. Bare ground and disturbance is your enemy in the landscape, so the less you disturb, the more you can occupy with living plant material, the more stable it's going to be. And it might not look as manicured, but I'll show you some very, very nice pictures of how I've worked on doing this in a moment. Don't park vehicles under your trees. Bad idea. It's compacting the soil, especially if you're in a clay soil. But even in Prescott, it's just not a good idea. Tree roots are living and they need oxygen. And by compacting the soil, you're limiting the oxygen. Pervious paving is a really nice way to go if you need to use paving. So using pavers or some other mulch. Native grass lawns and meadow areas are just, they can have just a multitude of different interest things going on seasonally all year long. So consider using that to, rather than gravel mulches. And then allow your native and naturalized type plants, or drought adapted, to be what they are. In other words, don't just give them water all the time because they look great when you water them. Let them look dry and let them look tough once in a while, because a little bit of that tough love will help them withstand the hard times. If it's drought tolerant, you've got to be able to tolerate the drought. So anyway, enough of that soapbox. This is an area in my yard. Of course, it's in the springtime, so the June grass is coming up, the penstemons are coming up. But all of these, there's a weed in there every once in a while, and I go and I pull it. And then If there's a blank spot, I transplant grasses from another part in my yard to fill this in. It is not manicured, but this is what the undisturbed areas around my house look like with a little enhancement. And so this is the kind of aesthetic that I really encourage you all to consider. And with that, I have just a nice little pretty picture. Within that large landscape like this, you start looking around and there's all kinds of little jewels like this hiding in there. And if you're out there enjoying it and looking at it, you just, it warms your heart. So anyway, that's all I had to present to you today. Hopefully I stayed on time pretty well. You do okay?
Hey everybody, good morning. My name is Josh Crothers. I'm the owner of Prescott Landscape Professionals. We're a local landscape contracting firm here in Prescott. We're here to talk about rainwater harvesting for the homeowner. So there's two traditional types of rainwater harvesting that generally come to mind. The first one would be active use and passive use. So Matt, if you'll hit that one. So the first one that we think about when we go active is, everybody's pretty familiar with this. We've got the roof surface collects in the gutter drains down into the tank, and then a tank can be utilized to store water for drought times, or perhaps used throughout the landscape as you need it to irrigate your plants. We're not going to dwell too much on that today. One other part of this though is also you can do below ground tanks. So that would be a cistern tank. It's buried below ground. Those typically have a lot more capacity, a lot more storage, and generally have an increased cost due to the need to pump water back out of said cistern out into the landscape and irrigate. But today we're really going to go ahead with using the rainwater via landscape design, right? So I mean, we see so many different kinds of landscape sites. We've got an existing home, say up near Thumb Butte, that was built in the 60s, very nice local landscape. You go all the way, say, to some of your newer production homes, where they've mass graded the entire site. There's absolutely nothing left. So we're trying to incorporate the use of landscape water through landscape design and then harvest said rainwater. So these are going to be your multiple steps that we're going to talk about a little bit more in depth. So we're going to look at site observation, total use of the site. We're going to look at our watershed. Where do we collect our water from and where does it go? We're going to try to make it really easy. So you can start small, you can grow big. We're going to want to slow down the water on the site. So if you think of traditional Prescott, most of our sites start at the top and go down to the bottom. A lot of hillside properties, right? So those are awesome for rainwater use and harvesting. We're going to have too much water, so we're going to want to manage that overflow. The use of plants. So doesn't have to be native, but obviously they're a little more drought tolerant, a little more successful with low water use. We're going to talk about ground covers a little bit. Jeff touched on those very nicely today too. Last but not least, there's multiple functions that you can use throughout the property, which we'll dive into. And then last but not least, we're going to look at, hey, what did we do? Did we start with something simple? How did it work? And what can we do to improve upon that? Okay. So Matt, go ahead. So the most important part of utilizing rainwater harvesting is going to be our site and our observation. And this is where the time is spent. And this is probably also the least used part in the commercial landscape, right? Because you go in, the house is already built, here's what we got. Nobody's really established what the site can do, but you want to think about it as a whole, because if you utilize this little picture here, right, we've got water coming from a roof, we've got a potential tank situation, we've got basins, we've got site runoff, we've got plant basins in these areas. So I mean, every aspect of your home site can be used to harvest rainwater. Where does the water flow? So if you're on a hillside property and say the high ground is back behind the house, water is going to be coming from up here going down. Where can you utilize that water? Where can you divert that water? Where can you store that water? Where can you hold it? You probably have either natural patterns, meaning the water is, rain comes down, hits the ground, and it flows through your lot or property in a particular manner. Maybe that's in a landscape swale that your landscaper built for you. Maybe that's a natural channel. Maybe it's just a flow pattern that comes down the hill. Where does it flow and where does it go? Because that's going to be your easiest way to capture that water and use it. Okay? And then the other thing too is, and I use the word native in a lot of cases, but what vegetation do you have on your lot? What are you trying to water? What can you amend? Where can you divert water, say, to pinions, or your ponderosis to help those trees? What kind of animal life do you have on your site? Do you have, in our backyard, we can sit in the living room or the kitchen and watch the deer come through about halfway up the back slope. Oddly enough, I live on Deer Trail, but but we watch those deer come through and they follow those same patterns. The javelina go down below our house, the same patterns. So using your site as a whole, we don't want to disrupt those, or we do, depends, right, what our goal and use is. But let's take into account where those wildlife patterns are and how the animals use the site so that we don't disrupt it, and or we could use rainwater to help, provide some irrigation for them. Last but not least, what kind of ground cover do you have? If you're in a production subdivision in Prescott or Prescott Valley or anywhere, you have probably nothing. The site's been completely graded. Most of your builders now are getting away from providing any kind of landscaping. If they do, it's going to be basic gravel, basic bland, we'll call it. And what are you going to do to cover that up? What are you going to do to prevent erosion? And, there's a whole litany of other things that can go with that. And last but not least, where's the runoff? So traditionally, we see you drive pretty much anywhere. What do? They connect to the downspout, they run the pipe all the way to the curb, and they outlet the water because they don't want it by the house, or they don't want it to impact the foundation. But, where is runoff here? You've got street runoff. You've got lot is going down to the street. Can you use that water? It's probably one of the easiest things to do is capture your existing runoff and hold it on the site. Matt, go ahead. So, top of the watershed, okay? So, we all know that blank flows downhill, right? And water finds its easiest, path of least resistance on your property. So, where is that coming from? Is it rain that's just going down onto a flat lot? Is it your roof? Is that your highest point on the lot? Okay, is that where, you're generating the majority of your water from? Is your site sloped? Does the site go from back to front to back, side to side? And then thereby, where can we use that water? Your watershed is, generally speaking, your lot boundaries, right? So that's all of the area that you can capture water within and use throughout the project. Again, where does it go? So, maybe you've got water entering right here that's flowing down through an existing channel. Maybe it's coming from the roof, draining down onto the lot, or maybe it's even from an adjacent property. We see that a lot where water is coming through and then drains down into your lot, and how do you use it? Where does it go? And thereby will give you some ideas on how you can use it. Last but not least, too, volume, right? So how many people in the room have a rainwater tank, say, on their gutter? A bunch, right? And how many times do you fill that and then watch it all overflow, out and through the yard, right? So volume is a huge component of that. If you have an existing channel, say, running from off-site through your property and you're trying to slow that down, well, we wouldn't want to slow down the Hassayampa River on our lot, right? But we might have abilities to utilize it through. So how much water do you have and how can you use it? Matt, go ahead. All right, so let's try to really make this easy. All right, we're going to jump into this a little bit further, but if you look at this picture here, they've got a roadway, they've got a curb, and they put in a curb cut, and then they put in a planting basin, right? Super simple. Try to keep whatever it is that you're doing on your lot simple, easy. Start small. If you only have, say, the ability for a 50-gallon rainwater tank, well, then put your garden right next to that, or put your annual plant bed somewhere small, somewhere easy that you can use it. Maybe it's one little basin up on your property to slow runoff down and hold water, say, around the base of one tree. Start there. See how that works. And then you want to try to get whatever your flow is, direct it into the basins. So if you have one basin around one ponderosa on your lot, you're doing great, but get that water into it, get it to hold, and get it to perk, right? Go ahead, Matt. All right, so slowing down the water. Again, I use most of our Prescott Hillside lots as a prime example. We get rainwater, we get roof runoff, we get off-site water draining through our properties. You know, most of the lots are on, say, a slope, some type of sloping system. So slow down that water. Find those flow patterns. Where does the water flow on your lot? It could be a natural pattern where it's always sort of run down behind, or you might go in and you might put in a big long berm to slow that down to, one, protect your house, but then two, use that water. Direct it to its use. So in this case here, they've started with earthworks, they've graded and made berms, and then they started planting alongside them, and over time the back of the berm, moisture soaks down through that berm, the plants can take it up through there, or it could be collected and run off in one way or another, you know, maybe to a large tree on the either end of a diversion berm. And no different than nature, water doesn't like right-hand turns, right? So you want to use undulating flow patterns. So in this case, they've come down the hill, built up a berm, come back down, come back up, come back down. So nice and slow, right? You want to soften that water flow down through the lot so that you can use it. Maybe it's a berm, maybe it's a check dam. So a check dam would be water that's flowing down. You want to slow down. You see these a lot on the side of the highway, believe it or not. So you'll go ahead and pile some kind of rock, kind of create like a solid check that the water can push through. Silts are accumulated and hung up. The water can continue to pass on down. Help that water percolate down and then percolate through. Slowing it down again in your plant basins, right? Because that's the end use. That's where we want the water to stay. We want to slow it down so it can percolate down and go into the roots for your trees and your shrubs. You could even do a sump. So a sump would be, you want to hold that water in a particular location. You can dig down 4 to 6 feet, create an area for that water to hold. Now you wouldn't want to do this right up against the foundation or, you know, something that could affect the structure, right? But if you've got the ability to hold that water, dig a big pit, let that water sift in through it, and that'll help to percolate that water throughout your lot. Probably one of the coolest things is going to be a bioswale. So a bioswale uses the same kind of idea and theory behind a sump. So you make your depression in the earth and in the soil down whatever depth is appropriate. You might hit a hard pan, you might hit clays, you might hit whatever, but you can dig it down, and then you can fill it up with a smaller particle gravel, lastly maybe even a sand or a silt, and then you put your mulch on top of that, and then that way you create, again, the ability for that water to percolate down nice and slow into the soil, and then you're planting around it. Go ahead, Matt. Just like our rainwater tank, right? We always have overflow. So when you start this process, maybe your water hits your tank and your gutter containment system, but then where do you divert that overflow to when you're not using it? So right here they've put a plant basin around a tree, and that way once this tank overflows, you're using that water. In this case, they utilize landscape design to create a walkway to the house, right? That might be impermeable pavers, it might be impermeable flagstone with natural joints, letting that water go through. But in this case, the berm or the walkway is up higher than the surrounding ground, right? But once that water flows off, it goes down into the basins. But it might also need to overtop. You might fill your basin. And once you fill that basin, you want that water to be able to continue to move through. So it would drain down to here. This one might overfill, drain down into here, so continue to use it. Terrace the water flow down through your lot. And so no different than when you use it to go down, you might have a series of berms. So if I collect my water here, water hits it, then drain it down into 2 more, 3 more, whatever makes the most sense depending on the area that you have. Now, you might also have to let that water go. There might be, small lot, inability to hold that much water. You might not have that many vegetative basins, right? And then at some point, you may have to let that outlet. Now, if you do, make sure you use erosion control methods so you're not depositing silts out, say, into a roadway or an area where it doesn't work. You can also create multiple sumps to manage that water down through your property. Again, a little harder in Prescott. we hit rock a lot. So multiples may be your best bet. Okay, Matt. So my favorite part as a landscaper is utilizing plants, right? So I use the word again native in here, but however you're planting, whatever works and will grow, this is the whole reason for the rainwater harvesting, right? So we're using this water for something. You want to utilize your plants in your basins. So, you know, in this case here, they've got some terraces, but each one of them's planted, and so thereby, as we cascade down through the lot, we have plantings throughout. You can use your basin, say, to take care of a specific focal point tree, and then you could put, say, grasses on the backside of the berm as that basin fills and irrigates the focal point tree. That water is also going to migrate in through your soil. So you'll want to be able to plant on the backside or front side or wherever you're running that water through and to, and that'll create supplemental sort of secondary irrigation. When your initial focus was the tree, you can then maybe say water grasses around that basin and add to the aesthetic. More importantly, too, mulch ground covers. We had a property right on Copper Basin Road. Nice couple. I don't know if they knew what they were doing, but they had someone come in and basically cover the entire lot with ground up mulch from the city of Prescott. And they hated it. They thought it was, you know, dirty, it wasn't maintained, but they absolutely loved it after the monsoon because all of the native flowers and grasses popped. And if you like that sort of look, not formal, but just vegetative, it exploded with unbelievable growth. The mulch ground cover, as Jeff talked about, helps make sure that your soils are a little bit cooler. It helps minimize evaporation back up from your catchment basins. And it also then continues to break down and adds organics into our soils. I say organics just that the natural materials break down, they go in, and they also help to feed our plants and that type of thing. Ground covers, spreading ground covers, something that can deal with, say, you know, the new home built in the neighborhood. And when we first come up to that site, they've got the house, they got the paver driveway, and it's nothing but dirt, right? So we want to try to utilize ground covers in any of the areas that are going to be disturbed and, say, not restored with either some type of rock, mulch, or gravel, which is traditional. Try to use your ground covers there. My favorite thing is to kind of create these rock and soil catchments. It's super easy to do. Any kind of topography on your lot, you can take and make a little rock line, little rock stack. It can be anywhere this tall, 2 or 3 little stones, like a little bitty triangle, kind of along the same theory as the check dam. Because what'll happen is as that material and water moves through, the silts will be caught on the rocks, and or you could backfill those rocks to create a little planting garden. All of a sudden now we've got something for plants to grow in, and then anything can be added. You can put your grasses in there, anything. Once you create that catchment, it adds a visual aesthetic, kind of cool. Use some native rocks from your site, and then you can get some plants going in there. Another thing that we do probably the most of is going to be native hydroseeding. So we use a mixture of native grasses, particularly grommas and side oats, to revegetate disturbed soils. A little different from rainwater harvesting, but again, we're talking about using native plants in our landscape here, and they will grow. They'll grow with our normal rainfall patterns that we have here in our chilling winters, and that's a great way too to help amend, say, your focal point planting, the plants that you've got in your catchment areas, and then maybe, say, in this area you don't go in with any kind of formalized gravel or ground cover. That's a great spot for hydroseeding, which will grow in and create that sort of pasture prairie look in those spots. So go ahead, Matt. All right, so again, multiple functions. This illustrates, a pretty good cross-section of most of the new homes that we see in Prescott area, right? So they've come in, they might have left some native areas in the back. outside of the disturbance zone. So hopefully those areas were fenced, non-disturbed, that type of thing. But if you look, the majority of these areas on this lot, you know, have basically been disturbed. There's no more native vegetation. They've probably planted a cool focal point tree, maybe for some shade, maybe for a visual element as they come in. But now you can take all of those various things that we just looked at and incorporate them on a new build. So again, top of our watershed, our water's coming down, it's collected in here. You've got multiple uses. We've got rain barrels that can drain out into a drip irrigation area. Maybe that's your vegetable garden. Maybe this is your native grasses area. Here's where we have a cistern that could be pumped out. They deal a little bit with gray water here. We're not going to go into that too much today. But basically now you can use it throughout your property, throughout all your various uses. You've got catchment basins for your gardens. You're using and reusing the water. You're irrigating your plants. And you're allowing it to infiltrate down into the soil. So one other benefit to that is, and I'm no hydrologist, but the more water we keep in our soil and get down, the better off our well properties are, aquifers are recharged, etc. So go ahead, Matt. All right, so let's say you have done any number of the things that we've talked about today. Maybe it's something as simple as one tank. Maybe it's something as simple as just one little berm around a ponderosa tree to catch some of that surface water. You want to look at that and go, okay, did we create a problem? We want to look at our site. Did we create some kind of benefit? Did we create, did we change runoff patterns for the worse? Did it actually store the water? Or do we need to make our catchment area bigger? What might it be? So did it work? And how did you use it? What worked? What didn't? And then you need to make modifications. So maybe we've created that one, really nice diversion berm, and we've caught water by that ponderosa. And every storm, it overflows and then creates an erosion problem. Well, look at where that erosion flowed, and perhaps you can create another berm, and that's sort of that manage zero overflow philosophy. What worked? What didn't? And then make adjustments, right? We can do that all the time. Go ahead, Matt. Special thanks really to, everything that I've learned about doing this is either through doing it wrong out in the field and learning what worked and what didn't, but I highly advocate the Rainwater Harvesting book by Brad Lancaster. You could dive into this and continue reading forever. A lot of the actual online photos that I found actually come from his book. So super huge credits to that. If you have even the remotest of interest, I'd encourage you reading that. So thank you, everybody, for letting me come talk to you today. Okay? Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Boy, these are two fantastic presentations. Thank you, Josh and Jeff. So, what I would like to do before we start the questions here is let me just go. So, okay, back to CWAG's website. Now, this presentation will be on our website in the video archive. So right here. It'll take maybe a week to get it up there. And so at the video archive, you see all of our previous programs are here for you to view. And so if you click on this one, which isn't here yet, it'll be in about a week, I'll see that we get up there links to Jeff's website and the handout. We can put a PDF of it. And Josh, if you have anything to put up there, get it to me, and we'll so you can access these. I know we didn't have enough copies of Jeff's handout to go around. Okay. So. Email me for that too. My email's on there. We can get it from somebody else. Yeah. So we'll put reference information because there's just so much information here. It's you can't get it all, but. You can go look at the video, and there'll be references and links for you. So I wanted to point out too that the City of Prescott's website has a lot of information on native and drought-tolerant plants. Jeff says he has more there, so we'll just leave we have on that landscape information page I showed you earlier is a link to the city's website. We're going to add Jeff's page to that. So let's move to some questions and answers. So why don't you guys come up here and let's keep the questions let's try to have conceptual questions, not so much my yard problem or things, and if there's something you need help with in your yard, maybe you can contact Jeff or Josh offline. So let's try and things you didn't understand or conceptual questions would be preferred.
A non-conceptual question would be, I have this pine tree.
A conceptual question would be like,
why is it bad to fertilize native plants?
okay,
Yeah,
all right.
those kinds of things.
Let's start here.
Jeff, that was my question. You mentioned don't fertilize ornamental plants. Could you define ornamental?
So they fertilize them in the nursery to get them going. But if you continue to fertilize them, they're not going to find what they need on their own out there in the real world. So unless you see a nutrient, I should have qualified it. If you see a nutrient deficiency, you might want to apply for that nutrient deficiency, such as iron deficiency or something like that. But if you give the plant all the nitrogen it wants, it will grow huge. It will be weak wood. It'll be more attractive to insects and disease and so on. And it won't form those mycorrhizal associations that we hope will help it survive the long term with less irrigation water. Oh, what is ornamental? Roses, fruit trees, lawns, vegetable gardens, and flower beds require fertilization, some sort of input. Ornamental is just something that we look at, a flowering shrub, a tree, a pine tree, evergreens, cacti, all of those things really don't need fertilizer to be happy. They want water.
Okay, I thought of the conceptual question. You hit me with it there and I froze up. So, I said earlier, 30% of Prescott's groundwater pumping is used seasonally. That's an average across the town. One thing that concerns me is that with all the new development going in, there's like 16,000 homes on the block, that could be filled in the next couple of decades. Yet Prescott has no means to get these people onto the kinds of worthy landscape practices. And so it seems important to me that we need to establish now that that the new homes should be drought-tolerant plants, rainwater harvesting, no groundwater used outdoors. The city's very resistant to that. I'm concerned about it because once the house is built, to me it seems like it's harder to fix it. And wouldn't it be better to do it in advance is my question. I mean,
yes.
all right, that's
Not to belittle the question at all, but yeah, of course.
I'd make a comment or two. One of the things, I don't like to get into these political issues because I'm a public servant, and I can't really align myself with a political point of view. CWAG, advocacy, that's, you guys are doing a fine job of putting forth ideas and things like that. I know, though, that that Morningstar development in Chino Valley, when it first marched out, that's what they wanted to do, and there was a lot of public resistance to that in some form or another. Do you remember that, Gary?
I don't.
Okay, so it was probably, 7, 8 years ago. Does anybody else in the room remember that? They said that no potable water is going to be used in the landscape in our subdivision. For whatever reason, that fell apart. It is easier to put the infrastructure in for gray water and things like that at the time of construction. And certainly if you're doing earthworks, that's the time to do the passive rainwater harvesting. And certainly most houses can be retrofit with various tanks and pumps and various things that you can use to enhance rainwater harvesting. But it's usually best if you think of that at the time of construction too. So as far as I'm not going to try and influence what a governing body would try and put forward, because I think CWAG is doing a fine job of putting forward those ideas. But what I would say is that I bet we'll start seeing more and more of this as time goes on. With gray water, you have to be really careful about what you're applying it on. You can't put it on food crops other than a nut tree that would grow here. So, and also you need to be able to divert the water back into the main traditional flow, either into a wastewater stream or a septic system or something like that. That's part of the rules for gray water. But there are so many opportunities for passive rainwater. And then if a municipality decided to go that direction, so be it. But I don't see it happening anytime soon. And I don't press me on the reasons. I think, economics and political will and all of those things, and those are beyond the scope of what the information I deal in.
Right.
Yeah, please.
One of the hurdles that we face as the landscape contractor is we're brought in to, say, a new home construction site at the very end. And so everybody's got the really killer cooktops and the really nice showers and all that stuff. But then when it comes to the landscaper, we're the last ones there, and there's no money left, which, I get. Okay, I'm used to it. But the encouragement that I would say is it starts with the individual. And so if this is something that you're cognizant of, make the change yourself and incorporate landscape design at the beginning, because you can have the heavy equipment and the dozers and the earthworks done very simply and about the same cost if you do it at the beginning. When we come in afterwards, there's no room to get in the backyard. We can't get a tractor back there. We can't get an excavator back there. So it starts with you guys all, the individual with the home and the construction. If you start there, you'll make it happen. So, cool. Thanks.
Okay, great. Yeah, see, CWAG is going to advocate for these things. We just want to be sure we're advocating for the correct policies, and that's why I asked that question. So let's get another question here. I'm going to kind of walk around and get that side of the room next, so I'll get around to everybody. Joyce.
We're in the process of starting to do some of the things that you're talking about, and we live on Thumb Butte, and we don't have a fence, but we have lots of wildlife. Are there things that you can plant to discourage the wildlife, and especially a lot of things get eaten? So how do I figure out what those things are?
It just so happens Cooperative Extension has javelina resistant plant publication and a deer and rabbit resistant plant publication. All that means is if they're not that hungry, they won't eat your plant. If they're hungry, they'll go off the menu and order different kinds of things. If you do not fertilize your plants and you water them appropriately and you allow them to be drought resistant, they will be less attractive to wildlife, but that's only after they're established. And there are many ways to individually protect a plant. Staking the tree is probably an important thing. But over in Sedona, when you're in an unfenced area, the apple tree foliage starts as high as a deer can stand on its hind legs. So you got to be ready for that if that's where you live, just like you're ready for the fire. Other than that, just making sure the root ball, so they can't just rip it out of the ground, and getting creative with small chicken wire cages on some of the smaller stuff. There's ways to do it. Don't believe in all the home remedies that are out there or dissuading wildlife. If they're hungry and it's droughty, they're going to come. And so, but there are many plants that they don't really mess with too much too, and you can start with those lists. The other thing that I'll just say, venison, but really, game species and bird species are managed. And if you start messing with birds, if they're not a pigeon, the grackles are native. but the little black ones, the starlings and the English sparrows, those are the only birds that are not protected by the Migratory Bird Treaty. So you gotta deal. You just gotta deal with it and try and pick things that'll be okay. And then once they get established, you know, there will be some herbivory, and that's to be expected because we're planting native plants that they're used to living amongst. So you have to give and take a little bit.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. Let's see, next question. By the way, I hear that tulips are basically like chocolate kisses to
Yeah,
Catalina.
tulips are chocolate kisses, but daffodils are poisonous. So, and crocus they like, but the narcissus they don't.
I was visiting with a landowner not long ago, and it's a typical sterile gravel mulched landscape with a few highlight trees. He sprays twice with a pre-emergent and then comes back with a Roundup to get what's left. And he does this every year. We're seeing lawsuits that suggest Roundup may go away. So it looks like there's going to be a need for a change, whether people like it or not. What are the good options to do when you've got that kind of a landscape when you buy a new house? New to you.
It was your choice to buy it. I'll start with that. The next thing I'll say is Roundup isn't the enemy as much as the public's making it. It's about as likely to cause cancer as red meat. So shoot me now for saying that, but that's the science. But given that, we want to minimize the amount of chemicals we're putting out there if we can. And so I would say, you know, rip out the gravel, put some organic mulch in, start small, create a small area of desirable herbaceous vegetation, and let that expand as your labor and neighbors will tolerate.
Okay, next question. Somebody here in the back area. Oh, okay, right here.
Nothing has been said about the impact of the seasons. I find a major problem with winter, specifically in the selection of plants, because it turns out that a lot of this junk that Home Depot and Lowe's sells you are ornamentals that will not withstand the winter. And is there in fact information someplace that helps me avoid those? And my second one is winter and water retention. If I have storage tanks, all of a sudden I have to start dealing with the concerns that I'm going to have frozen storage tanks. And, you know, what are the recommendations and suggestions in that area?
Well, I'll start on that one. So the first thing I would say is consult a professional, whether that be through Jeff's department on what plants do well, or, you know, a local landscaper with good level of experience. I can't tell you how many times we get the call of, oh, well, I just bought this at Home Depot and, you know, we'd like you to come out and plant it. And we'll look at it and say, well, that's not going to live. And so avoid that path if you can, because those plants are sourced nationally. They're going to be put into big area regions that are supposedly 7A or whatever you want to call it, if even they get that specific. So try to avoid your big boxes and go local. Talk to your local landscaper, talk to your local garden center, because they're not going to stock product that isn't going to grow here. Make sense? Well, you know, so, I mean, everything we can't, you know, black and white, gray. But as far as water catchment systems, you know, provide for drain down. So if you have a 1,000-gallon tank, bring it down to 600 gallons. That'll allow for thaw, you know, ice, that type of thing, down over the winter time. I mean, that's about the only other thing you could do to mitigate for freezing. Or let it flow. If you have moving water, it won't necessarily freeze. So those you do have some options for it. But then again, wintertime, we don't need as much water because usually Mother Nature is providing it. If we're freezing, we're snowing, that type of thing. So you can store for the...
Comment about the, I don't know if the battery's starting to fail on this thing. It's going intermittent. Anyway, as Josh pointed out, the big boxes. You can buy redwood trees at Home Depot sometimes and things like that. I actually know where there's a coast redwood tree in Prescott Valley that's doing quite well. There's one here in town too at the Methodist Church out there on Smoke Tree. That being said though, plants are often grown in LA, Orange County, San Diego County, and brought over here without allowing them to harden off to our climate. So that can be part of the problem. They can be really tender over there, brought over here, and they just aren't acclimated to where we are. So there are several production spaces at this elevation and in this area that you can buy their plants as well. Verde River growers, Prescott Valley growers, and there are many others that stock appropriate things. So it's an exception rather than the rule that the wrong plants are being sold here. But at the big box stores, you know, a lot of people grow hibiscus as annuals here and things like that. So you have to understand that too. People just want color and they're willing to pay for it, and someone's going to buy it. So you just have to maybe do a little due diligence. I forgot to mention that our Master Gardener Help Desk is open 5 days a week from 9 a.m. to noon and from 1 p.m. to 4, and you can come and talk to a Master Gardener volunteer about your issues, and they'll give you the time. And we also do a lot of pest and disease diagnosis. I'll hold it for a second. You'll get it.
Okay, question over in here is one in the, okay.
Hi, I have a second home in Show Low, and on that piece of property, if I want to plant something, I have to put gypsum in the hole to help the soil be more porous, so that I see your face. Okay.
That's incorrect.
Well, my question is, and you're going to answer it, I know, that if gypsum makes things more porous, would that help us save water if we put gypsum on our trees and plants? And would the roots go down deeper?
I bet there's some chemists in the room. What is gypsum? Gary? Calcium sulfate, not lime. It's calcium sulfate. It's pH neutral. What it's used for is when you have a sodium overload on your soil, the calcium will kick the sodium off the cation exchange complex that's there and allow the sodium to be leached, and the calcium will take over those exchange sites. That's the only use for it. But for years and years, the nursery industry has perpetuated this soil conditioning myth, and it is exactly that. It is a myth. So calcium sulfate helps with sodium problems. It does not break up the soil. It doesn't make it more porous. It does none of those things unless the sodium is the problem. Luckily, gypsum is extremely cheap. So you didn't spend your money on something that was too expensive, but really it probably served no purpose at all, unless you did a soil test and it told you that sodium is at a high level or even toxic on that site. So I know that other nurseries perpetuate this myth. Read the science. I would suggest not using gypsum. Suggest for what? Making the soil more permeable? You aren't going to make the soil more permeable, because the soil where you live is the soil that you have. And anything you amend it with will be gone in a year for a woody plant. So the plants that you plant need to be able to live in that soil. Prescott Valley, before humans colonized it like they have now, it was a grassland because of clay soils. Shrink and swell. Woody plant roots can't tolerate that. Now everything's irrigated. Trees grow there because of the irrigation.
So I like that answer. It's kind of like, quit struggling with it, go with the flow, you know? Deal with it, yeah. I want to point out too that there's a great example of a rain barrel and rain garden at the City of Prescott's Adult Center on Rosser Street that was designed by Barnabas Kane and installed with by Barnabas, and I think Prescott Creeks was also involved in it. So it's a great place. It's a public place. You can walk by without and look at it without getting in trouble, and I think it's an excellent example. So I had another question up here.
Yeah, you do. I recently, no I don't. I recently moved.
We need to get it on the video.
Oh, I recently moved from Seattle, so I'm starting to learn to love the color brown instead of green. My question to you really is your drought-tolerant plants. Okay, I planted them all around my damn house, and I'm having a fight with my wife about how much water do they need? How do I wean them off? I mean, up in Seattle, I'd water them 3 times a week, and I'd love it, because I don't use drought-tolerant plants up there. I use hostas. They suck down the water faster than you can give it to them. Down here, you put the grass in, you water it too much, and the damn thing dies on you. So, how do we wean it down? I mean, what's the deal?
I'm happy to take this one. In general, for a plant to be established, it takes a couple of years with supplemental irrigation. And then what you need to do is just kind of back away from it and let it dry out and wait for the leaves to droop. And if it stays droughty for a long time and it looks like it's not going to make it, you're going to have to irrigate it or it's going to die. So using your eye and using your common sense, trying to go that route. Don't overplant, but at the same time, choose appropriate plants. Things like cacti, you know, they look pretty tough at various times. They'll be all shrunken and look like a mummy, and but they recover from that. And a lot of our plants do. A lot of them will die to the ground, come back again. A lot of them will die to the ground and not come back again, and that's part of the cycle too. A lot of the labeled plants right out here are no longer there because they were herbaceous and they're ephemeral. So, you know, hopefully what you do is you pick the appropriate plants. Some of them can naturally regenerate, filling in the gaps, but as far as knowing when to wean them off irrigation, if it's a woody plant, I think you might need to supplementally irrigate it for a couple of years to get it established, but irrigate it out beyond the original root ball so that you encourage roots to go and explore that soil and become more self-sufficient.
Okay.
And go slow. Just back it off slowly as you go.
More questions? Oh, go ahead, please.
That was it? No, I was just wanted to talk about going slow. Yep.
Wean it off slowly from irrigation water.
Well, it's always a good idea to move your irrigation back out past your drip line. But also to this gentleman, he wants to reduce the water use so you can slowly, you know, maybe you're going from a half an hour to 18 minutes to, you know, something like that.
I would caution you to be careful about moving your emitters, because where the emitters were, there are roots. You move the emitters to a place where there's no roots. Now where it was used to getting water isn't getting water, and you have to wait for the new roots to grow into the other place. So adding emitters is always a better plan than moving them.
I wanted to talk, number one, I'm taking gypsum off my little list. And I guess that goes for Epsom salts as well. But what about essentially composting in ground, you know, with the eggshells, with shredded paper, with shredded cardboard? Discontinue that as well? And
okay.
There's part 2 then, please.
There's part 2 after this?
Well,
Judy! No, I'm kidding.
The other one is a fire-wise issue.
Okay. What I'll say about the magnesium sulfate, the Epsom salts, rose growers use that, and they say it intensifies the colors. I think there's enough available magnesium in the soil already, there's a lot of potassium in our soil from the granite, because granite contains feldspars, which contain, certain types contain potassium, and I've never seen a potassium deficiency here. Now, your other question was?
Well, it's like putting
composting.
greens and composting and eggshells and whatever, just mixing that routinely somewhere.
I'll be glad to provide a composting presentation sometime. It's a little off topic from here. I compost everything all the way down to pet hair, vacuum cleaner, dregs, all of that stuff. And you just keep a bucket on your kitchen sink, and any bit of decent water you're going to pour out, or old coffee or tea, should go on your compost as well, because maintaining a moisture level in the compost is important. Now, if you're just doing composting for waste reduction, that's different than composting to support a vegetable garden or some other thing. And so if you have a small amount, one of those composter bins is probably enough. And I tend to disagree with the eggshell thing. They don't break down that much, but you want to crunch them down, because if you have chickens, they'll learn how to peck their eggs if they see eggshells around that they can peck on. But on the other hand, I compost my eggshells, and they disappear just like everything else. And those eggs, so they dug up the eggshells, but those eggshells weren't hurting anything. And they were going to tell they were going to tell us what George Washington did on his property, which is pretty cool.
Okay, and I want to get the last question in, and this is to Josh. In your presentation, you focused mainly on passive rainwater harvesting. But when this rainwater harvesting idea came by, everybody was pretty much tuned in to gutters and barrels and like that. So is the passive your first choice? Is it the only choice? When is the tanks, the active rainwater harvesting system, when should people consider that?
Well, I think all choices are good choices. Whatever your use would be would determine perhaps the better choice for the application. So I didn't delve greatly into tanks and gutter systems because they're a little more common and a little more uniformly known about, but they're a great use when you can flow downhill from said location. But if I have a tank at the bottom of my property or at a low point, it's very hard to irrigate the ponderosa tree behind the house or up the slope. So it depends on the use, and I think everything is a component of the rainwater harvesting system. Does that make sense? And I think all of them can be used to create different uses throughout your property.
Okay, great. Well, please thank these two great presenters.